In a small town tucked away on the outskirts, there stood a humble store. It wasn't much to look at, just a worn building with faded signs and dusty shelves. The store's owner, Mr. Harris, was known throughout the town for his gruff attitude and short temper. His presence often made customers uneasy, and many would avoid shopping there if they could. The regulars, mostly locals who didn't mind the harsh treatment, knew what to expect when they entered. It was always a cold, impersonal experience. One such regular was Thomas, an elderly farmer who had lived in the area for most of his life. His weathered hands and worn clothing told the story of decades of hard work on the land. Despite his rough exterior, Thomas was a gentle soul, known for his quiet nature and the wisdom in his kind eyes. He wasn't wealthy, but he had always managed to get by, relying on the farm and the small store for his necessities. Unbeknownst to most, Johnny Depp, the famous actor, was in town for a personal visit. He wasn't there to draw attention or pose for pictures. He was simply looking for a quiet retreat. Little did anyone know he would witness something that would forever change the way they saw their town. Every week, without fail, Thomas made his way to the store. It wasn't a long walk from his farm, but the journey always felt longer than it should. He carried his old canvas bag, just big enough to hold a few necessities: flour, salt, sugar, and the odd can of soup. The town knew him well. He was a part of the fabric of it, though his presence was often unremarkable. He didn't own a car, nor did he use a modern phone. He wasn't bothered by the changing world around him, but he had never fully embraced it either. Thomas always greeted the locals with a quiet nod or a simple good morning, but he had no interest in engaging in long conversations. His life was the farm, the soil, the seasons, things that didn't require the hustle and bustle of the modern world. Yet he came to the store every week, relying on it for his most basic needs. Mr. Harris, the store owner, had never quite understood Thomas. Perhaps it was because the elderly man didn't seem to fit into the fast-paced world Harris tried to cultivate in his shop. Thomas didn't wear the latest clothes, nor did he speak with the same sharpness and authority as the other customers. Mr. Harris found this irritating, and it showed. On this particular day, Thomas entered the store, the bell above the door jingling softly. He moved slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he made his way to the shelves. Mr. Harris, already behind the counter, watched him with a scowl. "Back again, are we?" Mr. Harris muttered, his tone dripping with condescension. "Always in those dirty clothes. It's a wonder you manage to make it through the day." Thomas, trying to ignore the sharp words, simply nodded. He reached for the flour, his fingers stiff with age. The tension in the air grew thick as he made his way to the counter to pay. When it came time to settle the bill, Thomas fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a couple of crumpled bills. His hands shook with the tremors of arthritis, and he could feel his heart racing with the effort. Mr. Harris's patience wore thin. "Come on, old man, hurry up. I haven't got all day." His voice was sharp, each word like a jab, making Thomas feel smaller and smaller. The elderly farmer's face reddened with embarrassment as he struggled, but the anger in Mr. Harris's tone only grew more evident. "You're a real pain, you know that," Mr. Harris spat, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "Just get out of here." It was clear that Mr. Harris had no sympathy for Thomas's age or his struggles. The harshness in his words stung, and Thomas, humiliated, could feel his dignity slipping away as he stood there, unable to do anything but comply. The tension in the store escalated with each passing second. Thomas, still fumbling with the crumpled bills, was doing his best to calm his shaking hands. But Mr. Harris, standing on the other side of the counter, was having none of it. His face was twisted with irritation, and his patience had worn down completely. "I've had enough of you, Thomas," Mr. Harris snapped, his voice rising. "You're holding up the line, and now you're trying to scam me with these dirty bills. I should have known better than to let you in here again." Thomas froze, the words hitting him like a slap. His eyes widened with shock, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. He had been a customer in this store for years. He had never tried to steal anything, and yet now he was being accused of it. The hurt in his chest was almost unbearable, but he tried to push it down. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Thomas managed to say, his voice shaky, thick with emotion. He tried to explain, his words faltering as his heart sank deeper. I just wanted to buy my supplies, Mr. Harris. Please, I didn't mean any harm." But Mr. Harris was beyond reasoning. His face was red with anger, and his eyes glinted with a mix of contempt and frustration. "I don't want to hear it," he spat. "You're a nuisance, and I don't need your kind in here anymore." If you don't leave, I'll call the authorities. Thomas was stunned. The very thought that someone would call the police on him, someone who had lived peacefully in this town for so long, was unthinkable. His heart ached, his pride wounded beyond measure. He opened his mouth to say something, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The sting of rejection and humiliation choked him. All he could do was stand there, defeated. Unbeknownst to either of them, Johnny Depp had been quietly standing in the corner of the store. He had been there for a few minutes, just browsing, trying to stay unnoticed. But the moment the conflict began, his attention shifted entirely to the exchange between Thomas and Mr. Harris. Johnny's brow furrowed as he watched the elderly farmer being berated, his heart sinking with every harsh word that came from Mr. Harris. Johnny could sense the pain radiating off Thomas, the helplessness in his posture as the weight of the situation crushed him. He wanted to intervene, to stand up for the elderly man, but something held him back. It wasn't until the moment Thomas was told to leave that Johnny finally moved. But even then he didn't speak up. He simply watched, feeling a deep sorrow in his chest for the injustice unfolding before him. Thomas, utterly crushed, slowly turned around. His hands still trembled as he gathered his things and shuffled toward the door. The bell above the store entrance chimed quietly as he exited, the sound feeling almost too loud in the silence that had followed. As the door clicked shut behind him, it was as if the warmth of the store had left with him, leaving a cold emptiness in its place. Outside, the world seemed darker now. Thomas walked with his head bowed, his heart heavy with a sense of loss. The humiliation clung to him like a weight, and the simple act of walking home suddenly felt like the most difficult task he had ever faced. As the door clicked shut behind Thomas, Johnny Depp stood in the corner of the store, a heavy weight settling in his chest. His usual relaxed demeanor had vanished, replaced by a look of concern that was hard to miss. He had witnessed many things in his life, but the scene he had just watched left him deeply disturbed. The elderly man, simply trying to buy groceries, had been humiliated in front of everyone. Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that what he had just seen was more than just a bad day for Thomas. It was an injustice. It wasn't just about the harsh treatment, it was the way a person could be so easily discarded simply because they were old or struggling. The anger that simmered in Johnny was not the kind that flared up quickly. He was calm, always, but today, something inside him urged him to take action. He walked up to the counter, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet store. Mr. Harris, who had been too busy counting the register to notice Johnny's approach, looked up with surprise. He assumed Depp was just another customer, but Johnny's presence was anything but ordinary. "Mr. Harris," Johnny said, his voice calm but carrying an air of quiet authority that immediately put the shopkeeper on edge. "Can I ask why you treated that man the way you did?" Mr. Harris stuttered, clearly taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" "That old man was causing trouble. Always slow and in the way. Johnny interrupted him, his voice steady and direct. "You humiliated him, you didn't treat him like a person. Why?" The shopkeeper hesitated, trying to brush it off. "He's just a nuisance, an inconvenience. It's not like he's any help around here." Johnny's eyes narrowed. He leaned in slightly, his presence commanding. "He's a human being, Mr. Harris, and that's all that matters. You don't get to decide someone's worth based on their age or how they look. We all deserve respect, no matter who we are." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, Mr. Harris was silent. Johnny, using his fame not for glory, but to shed light on a real issue, had made it clear this wasn't just about a simple transaction, it was about treating people with kindness and dignity. Johnny stood there for a moment, his words hanging in the air as he locked eyes with Mr. Harris. The tension was palpable, and for a brief moment, the store seemed to grow quieter. Mr. Harris, still flustered and unsure how to react, seemed to shrink under the weight of Johnny's quiet intensity. But Johnny wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his voice softer now but still resolute. "I'll take care of his groceries today," he said, reaching into his wallet. "It's the least I can do. And from now on I suggest you treat people with more respect, regardless of how they look or how slow they are." Mr. Harris, clearly taken aback, stammered, "You don't need to, he's not worth." "I'll pay," Johnny interrupted gently, his expression firm. "It's not about the money, it's about dignity. You've already made a mistake today, and I don't want to see it happen again." Johnny handed over enough cash to cover Thomas's groceries, and even a little extra for the trouble. The shopkeeper was too ashamed to argue, but the awkwardness of the moment was undeniable. He muttered something about making sure it doesn't happen again, but the sincerity was absent, his discomfort evident. Johnny turned and walked toward the door, his gaze catching Mr. Harris's one last time. There was no anger, just an air of quiet judgment. It was clear that Johnny wasn't looking for revenge. He simply wanted Mr. Harris to understand the gravity of the situation. As Johnny left the store, he could hear the low murmurs of the townspeople outside, gathering around and whispering about what had just unfolded. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small town, and soon everyone knew what had happened. It wasn't just about a famous actor stepping in to help a local, it was about the way people treated each other. Locals began to talk about how Mr. Harris had mistreated Thomas, many of them expressing their disapproval. "I can't believe he'd treat an old man like that," one woman remarked to her neighbor. "Thomas has always been so kind and never asks for much. The way he was treated just for being old and a little slow, disgusting," another person muttered as they passed by the store. By the time the next few days had passed, the store was nearly empty of customers. Those who had once quietly tolerated Mr. Harris's behavior now felt emboldened by Johnny Depp's quiet act of kindness. People began to avoid the store, making their purchases at a nearby market instead, sending a clear message to Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris, now left to ponder the consequences of his actions, couldn't shake the embarrassment that had followed. He had lost the respect of his community, and no amount of apologies would undo what had been done. It was as though Johnny had opened a window into the way the town had been ignoring its moral compass for far too long. A few days later, Johnny returned to the town, not to seek attention or a grand gesture, but to speak with Thomas privately. He found the elderly farmer sitting alone on a weathered bench near the edge of the town square, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Johnny sat beside him, offering a warm smile. "How are you holding up?" Thomas looked at him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "I'm all right. I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me, especially not like that." Johnny chuckled softly. "You deserve better than that. It's not right when people treat you like you don't matter." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. Then Johnny spoke again, more quietly this time. "I want you to know something. I've heard about your farm struggles. I've seen the way you care for it, even when things aren't easy." Thomas's eyes welled up, the truth of his hardships finally slipping out. "It's been hard. I've tried to keep it going, but it's a lonely life. The farm, the land, it's all I have left, and the store was the only place where I felt like someone cared, even if it was just for a few minutes." Johnny nodded, understanding more than Thomas could have known. "You're not alone, Thomas. There are people who care. Sometimes it just takes a little reminder for us all to see what really matters." Thomas smiled, his heart lightened by the conversation. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so invisible. He felt seen, understood, maybe even for the first time in years. Johnny's kindness had brought more than just groceries that day. It had restored something deeper, something that would remain long after Johnny had left. Weeks passed after the incident, and the small town seemed to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. People began treating each other with more kindness, a new awareness creeping into the community. Even Mr. Harris, whose reputation had been tarnished by his actions, began to feel the weight of what he had done. The town's disapproval, coupled with his own growing guilt, had begun to change him. He realized that he had let his frustration and prejudice cloud his judgment, and had treated someone who didn't deserve it poorly. One afternoon, Mr. Harris made his way to Thomas's farm. Johnny Depp had already left the town, quietly slipping away without the fanfare one might expect. But Thomas, who had always remained humble, was there when Mr. Harris approached. The older man looked different now, his shoulders sagged with regret, and his eyes no longer held the same dismissive edge they once did. "Thomas," Mr. Harris began, his voice sincere, "I owe you an apology. The way I treated you, it was wrong. I've had time to think about it, and I want to make things right. I'm offering you free groceries for the rest of your life." Thomas listened quietly, then gave a small smile. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harris, but I don't need anything for free. What I need is for you to understand that kindness doesn't cost anything. People just need to be treated with respect." With a slow nod, Thomas extended his hand, and Mr. Harris took it. The handshake was simple, but it was enough. An unspoken understanding between two men, one seeking redemption, the other offering forgiveness. As Johnny Depp left the town, there was no press, no grand gestures, just a quiet peace in the air. His presence had made a lasting difference, planting a seed of compassion in a place that needed it, and for Thomas, that was all he needed to feel whole again. In the weeks that followed, the town's atmosphere slowly began to change. While Johnny Depp's time there was brief, his impact lasted far longer than anyone could have imagined. The community didn't remember him as a celebrity, but as a person who, in a quiet moment, stood up for what was right. His act of kindness became a story passed from one person to another, not as gossip, but as a reminder of the importance of treating others with dignity and respect, no matter their age or status. Mr. Harris and Thomas, once strangers to understanding, shared a new bond, a bond forged through humility and forgiveness. The shopkeeper's apology had not been just words, it had been a chance for both men to grow, to realize the weight of their actions, and how deeply kindness could change a life. Thomas, with a quiet dignity restored, continued his weekly visits to the store, but now, he no longer felt the sting of humiliation. While things might never be perfect, there was a warmth in the air, a renewed sense of respect among the townspeople. The incident, though painful at the time, had sparked something beautiful. It reminded everyone of what it truly means to be human, to care for one another, to listen, and to treat everyone with kindness, no matter the circumstances. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story of kindness, humility, and redemption. It's a reminder that sometimes, the smallest acts can make the biggest difference in someone's life. Johnny Depp's quiet but powerful gesture sparked change in a small town, showing us all the importance of standing up for what's right and treating others with respect. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more emotional stories like this, and comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think, and of course share this video with your friends to spread a little kindness today. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.